Dr. Elias Carter had never believed in aliens. As a scientist, he trusted only what could be observed, tested, and proven. So when a strange, unexplainable sound echoed across the quiet forest one cold evening, he thought nothing of it at first. But as the noise grew louder, vibrating through the ground, his curiosity couldn't be ignored. He grabbed his jacket, stepped out of his cabin, and followed the sound through the woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only light came from the stars above, barely piercing the dark sky. Elias knew this part of the forest like the back of his hand. But tonight something felt different. The sound was unmistakable now, a deep rumble, almost like an explosion. It was coming from beyond the ridge, where few dared to go. He quickened his pace, pushing through the underbrush, and reached the top of the hill. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. A large metallic object had crash-landed in a clearing below him. The strange ship was shaped like nothing Elias had ever seen before, smooth, with curved edges that gleamed under the moonlight. It was clearly damaged, the surface scorched and dented, smoke curling from various sections. Elias's heart raced, both with fear and fascination. Instinctively, Elias began to descend the hill, moving toward the wreckage. His breath was quick, the adrenaline already pumping through his veins. As he drew closer, he saw that the ship was small, only about the size of a car. But what struck him more was the strange energy that seemed to pulse from it. Then a low whine sounded, followed by a soft hiss. A door, or some kind of hatch, slowly opened in the ship's side. From within, a faint glow emerged, followed by the soft groan of someone, or something, struggling. Elias stepped forward cautiously, his mind racing. Was this some kind of test or experiment? Had a satellite crashed? But no, this wasn't like anything he had ever seen. And then he saw her, a figure lying motionless on the ground near the ship. She was unlike anything Elias had ever imagined. Her skin was pale, almost silver, and her long hair shimmered in colors that seemed to change in the light. She was dressed in strange, form-fitting clothes that shimmered with an otherworldly design. The first thing Elias noticed, however, was the blood. It was dark and unfamiliar, staining the alien's clothing and pooling beneath her. Elias's heart sank. Without thinking, he rushed toward her, falling to his knees beside her. Her chest rose and fell, but it was faint. She was alive, but barely. "Hey, can you hear me?" Elias whispered, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. To his relief, he felt a weak but steady heartbeat. He quickly took off his jacket and placed it beneath her head as a makeshift pillow. His training kicked in as he moved swiftly to assess the situation. The alien's breathing was labored, and she had several cuts and bruises, some of which were deep. Her arms were bruised, and her leg appeared broken. He knew that if he didn't act fast, she wouldn't survive long. He muttered to himself, unsure what to do next. He had never dealt with anything like this before. Alien life forms weren't something he studied, but her pulse was weak, and the amount of blood she had lost was alarming. Elias looked around, spotting his nearby cabin in the distance. It was a long shot, but it was the only place with any kind of medical supplies. Elias didn't hesitate. He gently lifted her into his arms, grunting under the weight, and began to make his way back to his cabin. Her strange, faintly glowing eyes flickered open briefly, locking with his. He froze for a moment, staring into them. They were the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen, an almost impossible mix of blue and violet, full of confusion and fear. But she couldn't speak, her lips barely moved, and she sank back into unconsciousness. By the time Elias reached the cabin, his muscles were sore, but he didn't care. He hurried inside and gently placed her on the operating table he used for research. The warmth of the cabin was a stark contrast to the cold night outside, and Elias moved quickly to fetch his medical kit. His hands were shaking as he cleaned her wounds, working as fast as he could. He used everything he had, bandages, antiseptic, and whatever else he could find. But it was clear her injuries were far beyond what Earth's medicine was prepared for. Just as Elias finished wrapping her injuries, the pod's eye, a small floating orb he built years ago, hummed to life. It had been powered on by the ship's energy when it connected with the alien. A voice echoed from the orb, a soft, synthetic tone. Warning: hostile forces have located the subject. Immediate medical attention required. Protect her at all costs. Elias's eyes widened. Hostile forces. He had no idea what this meant, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer dealing with an ordinary situation. He was in the middle of something much bigger than he could understand. And despite the danger, he couldn't turn back now. As the hours passed, Elias worked tirelessly. His hands moved with practiced precision, but his mind was far from calm. The alien, whom he had now begun to call Nissa in his thoughts, lay unconscious on the operating table. The strange glow in her skin had dimmed, but her breathing remained slow and shallow. Elias had never treated anything like her before. Her biology was so different from anything he had encountered in his years as a scientist. His mind raced with questions. Where did she come from? What was the strange energy he felt when he first touched her? And most importantly, why had she ended up on Earth? These questions only added to his worry, but there was little time to think about them. He needed to help her, and that was the only thing that mattered right now. Elias paused for a moment and examined her more closely. Her features were delicate, almost angelic, and her hair shimmered like stardust in the dim light of his cabin. Her clothes, though damaged, were unlike anything human fashion could replicate. The fabric seemed to change color depending on how the light hit it, shifting between deep purple and silvery blue. Elias had never seen anything like it. Shaking his head, Elias turned his attention back to her injuries. Her leg was broken, badly bruised, but it was the deep gashes along her side that worried him most. He had cleaned them as best as he could, but there was only so much Earth medicine could do. He was no surgeon, and this wasn't an average injury. He knew he had to do something more, or she might not survive. Elias grabbed his medical kit and started working again, carefully tending to her wounds. As he did so, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. There was an energy in the room, a hum that he couldn't explain. It was faint but present, like a static charge that prickled against his skin. With a soft sigh, Elias turned back to Nissa and carefully began applying a healing gel to her side. As his fingers brushed against her skin, the hum grew stronger. Suddenly, he froze. Her body, which had been lifeless until then, twitched ever so slightly. Her fingers curled, and a soft, glowing pulse radiated from her chest. Elias's heart skipped a beat. Was she waking up? But then the energy subsided, and her body went still again. Elias didn't know what to make of it. He had never seen anything like this in all his years of study. Could her body be reacting to the treatment in ways he couldn't understand? Or was there something more going on here than just physical healing? The AI orb hovered nearby, its soft voice interrupting his thoughts. Warning: biological instability detected. Immediate action required. Elias frowned, looking at the floating orb. What do you mean by biological instability? The orb's lights flickered before it responded. Subject's biology is unstable. Energy fluctuations detected. Possible overload. Elias felt a knot form in his stomach. He hadn't noticed anything unusual beyond the faint pulses, but the orb's warning was clear. He had to act fast. There was something wrong, something beyond simple injury. He quickly began scanning her with his equipment, pulling out various tools that could monitor energy levels and bioelectric fields. As he worked, he noticed the strange readings on his screen. The patterns were like nothing he had ever seen before. The energy her body was emitting wasn't just healing. It was adjusting, changing in ways that defied his understanding of biology and physics. It was then that Elias remembered the strange hum he felt earlier, the one that had seemed to come from Nissa herself. It was as if her body had some kind of power that could not be measured by Earth standards. Could she be using energy from the environment around her to heal herself? Or was it something deeper, something tied to her alien origins? Elias's curiosity got the best of him. He had to know more. With a deep breath, he carefully placed a hand on Nissa's shoulder. Her skin felt warm, like a soft electric current was flowing beneath it. The moment his hand touched her, the glow around her body intensified, and for a brief moment, Elias felt a strange sensation, a flicker of images that weren't his own. He saw images of vast, glowing cities, huge starships gliding through space, and the face of an alien king. The images were fleeting, but they were clear enough for Elias to recognize that Nissa's world was far beyond anything he could have imagined. It was beautiful, and yet it was also filled with tension. He could sense the fear and urgency that surrounded her. As quickly as the images came, they disappeared. Elias pulled his hand away, heart racing. What had just happened? Nissa's body convulsed slightly as if in response to his touch, but this time, she did not remain still. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open. They were a stunning shade of violet, glowing softly in the dim room. Elias stepped back, feeling a sense of awe and unease. Who are you? Nissa's voice was faint, but it carried a strength that surprised him. She looked around the room, her gaze landing on Elias. I'm Dr. Elias Carter, he said gently. I found you. You were injured. Nissa's eyes seemed to widen as she took in her surroundings. I remember. The crash. My ship. My people. Her voice trailed off, her expression growing distant. Elias didn't know what to say. The fact that she was speaking at all was a good sign, but he could see the confusion in her eyes. She wasn't entirely awake yet, and the pain in her body still seemed overwhelming. Don't worry, Elias said softly. You're safe here. I'll help you. Nissa's gaze softened, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. But before he could speak again, her body shuddered slightly, and she fell back into unconsciousness. Elias let out a sigh, his mind still racing with questions. He had so many things he needed to figure out. About her people, and about the strange connection he felt to her. But for now, all he could do was wait for her to heal. He only hoped he was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Elias woke up to a sense of uneasy quiet. The cabin was still, with the soft hum of his lab's machines the only sound in the air. He had barely slept through the night. His mind had been spinning with questions about Nissa, about the strange energy she had emitted, and about the mysterious life she seemed to have left behind. He glanced at the operating table where Nissa lay. Her breathing had slowed, and her face looked more peaceful than before. The glowing in her skin had faded, but Elias knew better than to assume things were back to normal. The energy she had radiated was still fresh in his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder what it all meant. He stood up and moved toward her, his steps light on the wooden floor. He gently checked her vitals once more, making sure she was still stable. Her pulse was steady, though faint. Elias let out a soft sigh of relief. He had been worried the night before, worried that she might not make it, or that her alien biology might be too complex for his earthly knowledge to handle. As he adjusted a few things on the table, he heard a soft sound, a quiet murmur. He froze. Nissa's eyelids fluttered slightly, her lips parting as if she were trying to speak. Hey, take it easy, Elias said softly, trying not to startle her. He carefully adjusted her position, making sure she was comfortable. Nissa's eyes flickered open fully, revealing those glowing violet irises that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Her gaze immediately locked onto Elias, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of confusion in her expression. She blinked a few times, as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. Where am I? Her voice was soft, faint, but clear enough to hear. You're safe, Elias answered, his voice gentle and reassuring. You crashed here. I found you and brought you back to my cabin to treat your injuries." Nissa's gaze shifted around the room, taking in her surroundings slowly. The cabin was small, but cozy, filled with books, research equipment, and the remnants of a life lived in isolation. She seemed to notice everything. The desk cluttered with papers, the window that looked out over the woods, and the small bed where Elias had spent the night in his chair, keeping watch. She shifted slightly, wincing in pain, her hand moving to her side. Elias quickly stepped forward, but she held up a hand, signaling him to wait. "I am still in pain," she said, her voice strained. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect herself. "But I feel better. What is this place?" Elias paused, considering his words carefully. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he also knew that answering her questions was important. "This is Earth," he said simply. "My name is Elias Carter. I'm a scientist. I found your ship, and I've been helping you." "Earth." Nissa whispered the word, as if testing it on her tongue. "I did not know where I had come." The crash. Her face twisted in a mixture of pain and confusion. "You were injured when I found you," Elias said, trying to soothe her. "But you're healing now. Slowly, but you're healing." Nissa's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a soft, almost imperceptible smile on her face. Despite her pain, she seemed to appreciate his words. "You saved me." Elias nodded, his voice calm but firm. "I couldn't leave you. You were in danger." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful, as if considering something deeply. Then, as if deciding on something, she spoke again. "I do not remember much. The crash, my people, my father." Her voice trailed off as if something painful had been triggered in her mind. "Don't worry about it now," Elias said quickly, not wanting to push her. "Rest for now. You've been through a lot." Nissa closed her eyes, but Elias could see her mind was still racing. She was clearly trying to piece together what had happened, where she was, how she had ended up on Earth, and why she had been running. Elias could only imagine the weight of it all. After a long silence, Nissa spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" Elias didn't hesitate. "Now we make sure you're fully healed. Once you're better, we'll figure out what to do next." Nissa opened her eyes again, looking up at him with those violet orbs. "You would help me, even though I am not of your world." Elias smiled softly. "I didn't save you because you're from another world. I helped you because it's the right thing to do." He paused, meeting her gaze. "I believe in helping others, no matter where they come from." For a long time, Nissa didn't speak. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. But then, to Elias's surprise, her lips parted slightly in a smile, a rare and fragile smile that somehow made everything feel a little brighter. "Thank you, Elias," she said quietly. "I do not know what I would have done without you." Elias felt a warmth in his chest at her words. He wasn't sure what kind of journey lay ahead for both of them. But one thing was clear. Helping Nissa had already started to change everything. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elias felt a sense of purpose, a deeper connection to something far greater than himself. He had no idea what would happen next, but he was ready to face it, whatever it might be. Over the next few days, Nissa's condition steadily improved. Her wounds were healing, though Elias suspected it wasn't just the medical supplies doing the work. There was something extraordinary about her body, how quickly it adapted, how resilient it seemed. He watched her closely, not out of fear, but fascination. Nissa, on the other hand, was beginning to understand this strange world she had landed in. Though she was still weak, her mind was sharp, and she asked Elias endless questions. "What is this?" she asked one afternoon, holding up a small leather-bound book she had found on his desk. Elias smiled as he set down the mug of tea he had been drinking. "That's a journal, a place to write down your thoughts, ideas, or discoveries." Nissa ran her fingers over the cover, her violet eyes filled with curiosity. Do humans always record their thoughts this way? Some do, Elias replied. I use it to keep track of my experiments and observations. He hesitated, then added, it helps me make sense of things. When I write something down, it feels less overwhelming. Nissa tilted her head, considering his words. I see, she said softly. In my world, we store memories differently. We don't need physical objects to remind us of what we've experienced. Her words made Elias pause. He wanted to ask her more, to learn about this advanced world she came from, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. She was still recovering, and he didn't want to push her too hard. Instead, he changed the subject. How are you feeling today? He asked, moving closer to where she sat on the couch he had set up for her. Better, Nissa said with a small smile. Your kindness has helped more than you know. Elias shrugged, brushing off her praise. It's not kindness. It's just the right thing to do. Nissa looked at him for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful. Your people are different, she said finally. When I first arrived here, I was afraid. I thought I might be met with hostility, with fear. But you are not like that. Elias frowned. Why would you think that? We're not all bad, you know. Nissa hesitated, her expression troubled. In my travels, I have seen many worlds, she said slowly. Not all are welcoming to outsiders. Some fear what they do not understand. Others see strangers as threats. She glanced down at her hands. I have seen the worst of what fear can do. Her words hung heavy in the air, and Elias felt a pang of sadness for her. He couldn't imagine what she must have gone through to feel that way. Well, you don't have to worry about that here, he said firmly. Not while you're with me. Nissa's eyes softened, and for the first time, Elias thought he saw a glimmer of hope in her expression. Thank you, Elias, she said quietly. Your world may be small, but it is filled with warmth. Elias chuckled at her words. Small. Compared to what? Nissa smiled faintly, but there was a sadness behind it. Compared to the worlds I have seen, the vast cities that stretch across the stars. My people, we are travelers, explorers, but even we have not seen everything the universe holds. Elias leaned forward, curiosity shining in his eyes. Tell me about them. Your people, your home. What's it like? For a moment, Nissa hesitated, but then she began to speak, her voice steady, but tinged with emotion. My world is called Sirith, she said. It is a place of light, of beauty. Our cities float above the ground, powered by energy fields that we have harnessed for centuries. We live in harmony with our planet, taking only what we need and giving back in return. She paused, her gaze growing distant. But not all is perfect. There are those who seek power, who would use our knowledge for destruction. That is why I left. My father, he is the king of Sirith. He wanted me to stay, to be safe, but I could not sit idly by while our enemies grew stronger. I took a ship and left, hoping to find a solution, a way to protect my people. Her voice broke slightly, and she looked away. But instead, I crashed here. Elias watched her, his heart heavy with sympathy. You didn't fail, he said softly. You survived. And maybe you found something here that can help. Nissa looked at him, her expression unreadable. Perhaps, she said quietly, or perhaps my presence here will bring danger to your world. Elias shook his head. We'll deal with that if it comes. For now, you need to focus on getting better. Nissa nodded, though her gaze remained troubled. You are a strange man, Elias Carter, she said after a moment. But I am glad I found you. Elias smiled. I'm glad I found you too, Nissa. As the sun began to set outside the cabin, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange, Elias and Nissa sat in companionable silence. Though their worlds were vastly different, there was a connection forming between them, a bond that neither could fully understand, but both could feel. And for the first time in a long while, Elias felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The days that followed were peaceful. Nissa continued to recover, her strength growing day by day. Elias was grateful for the quiet, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. A shift he couldn't explain. Despite his growing bond with Nissa, a quiet unease lingered in the back of his mind. One evening, as they sat outside the cabin under the stars, Nissa turned to him with a serious expression. The glowing purple of her eyes softened in the dim light. "Elias," she said quietly, "there is something I need to tell you, something important." Elias looked up from the fire they had built. The flames danced in the cool night air, casting shadows on their faces. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle. Nissa hesitated for a moment before speaking. "When I left Sereth, I did not just flee my people's enemies. I was also running from something else." Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept her gaze steady. "A force, a power, that is beyond anything I've ever known. It is relentless, and it follows me." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of force?" "It's hard to explain," Nissa said, her brow furrowing as she thought. "It is like a shadow, a presence that bends the rules of the universe. It knows no mercy, and it consumes everything in its path." Her hands clenched, as if to hold back the fear rising in her chest. "I have felt it since I left Sereth, and I know it is getting closer." Elias stared at her, unsure of what to say. The thought of an unstoppable force coming to Earth was terrifying, but he couldn't let fear take hold. Not now. Not when Nissa needed him. "Is there anything we can do to stop it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing sense of urgency in his chest. Nissa shook her head slowly. "I don't know. It moves in ways I cannot predict. I've seen its destruction, but it is always hidden, always just out of reach. It is otherworldly." She looked down, her shoulders heavy with the weight of her words. "That's why I left Sereth. I thought I could find a way to protect my people, but now I fear that I've brought it here." Elias was quiet for a long time, his mind racing. If what Nissa said was true, then the peaceful life he had known could be at risk. But he wouldn't let fear control him. He had to be strong, for Nissa and for the world he called home. "We don't know everything about this force yet," Elias said after a moment. "We'll figure it out, together." Nissa looked at him, her expression softening. "You are kind, Elias, but I don't want to put your world at risk. You have done so much for me already." Elias gave her a reassuring smile. "You're not a threat, Nissa. Whatever is after you, we'll face it. We'll protect Earth, and if we have to, we'll fight it." A flicker of something, hope, maybe, shone in Nissa's eyes. She seemed to relax, if only slightly, at his words. "I've never met anyone like you before," she said softly. "You truly believe that, don't you?" Elias nodded. "I do. You're not alone in this, Nissa. We're in this together." As the night grew darker and the fire flickered low, they both sat in silence, contemplating what lay ahead. Elias had never faced anything like the threat Nissa described, but he wasn't about to let fear stop him from protecting his world and the alien woman who had captured his heart. The next morning, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Elias had always been a man of logic and science, but the idea of an unknown force capable of crossing galaxies was something that could not be explained away with formulas and equations. He knew that if they were going to stop it, they would need more than just knowledge. They would need a plan. "Nissa," he began as they sat at the table, breakfast in front of them. "I think it's time we start learning more about this force. If we can understand it better, maybe we can find a way to stop it." Nissa nodded. "I agree. The sooner we act, the better." Her expression grew serious again. "But I must warn you, Elias, the closer we get to finding this force, the more dangerous it will become." Elias didn't flinch at her words. He had already decided that whatever came next, he would face it head-on. "I'm ready. We'll do this on our terms." Nissa's eyes searched his face, as if measuring him for the first time. She seemed to see something there, something she hadn't noticed before. A determination, perhaps. "I'm glad I found you," she said quietly. "You may not understand what's at stake, but your bravery is comforting." Elias didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't used to receiving praise, especially for something he had never thought twice about. He was just doing what anyone would do. "We'll face this together, Nissa," Elias said firmly. "We have each other. That's what matters." With those words, they began to make their first real plan. They knew they had little time, but the urgency in the air pushed them forward. Elias gathered every piece of information he could about otherworldly phenomena, hoping to find something, anything, that might give them a clue about the threat Nissa was running from. The hours turned into days as they prepared. The tension was palpable, but so was the determination. Elias was no longer just a scientist trying to help an injured traveler. He was now a protector, working alongside Nissa to safeguard everything he knew and loved. And somewhere in the distance, something watched. The shadow Nissa had feared. It was closing in, but they were ready. They had to be. Days passed in a blur of activity. Elias and Nissa worked tirelessly to prepare for the unknown force that was coming. While Nissa shared everything she knew about the power chasing her, Elias immersed himself in his research. He dug into old records, theories, and anything that might offer a clue to understanding the threat. But no matter how hard he looked, he found nothing concrete. There was no sign of anything that could explain what Nissa had described. Yet the more time they spent together, the more Elias felt something was drawing near. He couldn't explain it. Just a sense of unease, like a storm brewing just out of sight. He noticed Nissa seemed to feel it too. She would often look to the horizon, her gaze distant, as though searching for something only she could sense. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, they sat together outside the cabin, each lost in their own thoughts. "I don't like this," Nissa said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, her tone filled with a quiet intensity. "I can feel it. It's closer now. The force that follows me." Elias felt a chill run through him. He had never seen Nissa so unsettled. She had been calm, almost serene, since they began planning, but now her eyes were filled with an unmistakable dread. "What do you mean by closer?" Elias asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Nissa's gaze never left the horizon. "It's not just a feeling anymore. I can sense it moving through the air, through the ground. It's reaching out, looking for me." She clenched her fists, her face tight with determination. "I can't run forever. It will find me. And when it does, I don't know if anyone will survive." Elias swallowed hard, trying to absorb her words. He had never imagined that something so terrible could exist, something so beyond the grasp of human understanding. But Nissa wasn't just any ordinary person. She was from a world far beyond his own. And if anyone could know the truth about this force, it was her. "What can we do?" Elias asked. Nissa turned to him, her expression softening just a little. "We must face it. I don't know how, but we have to confront it. It cannot be allowed to destroy everything. Not your world, not mine." Elias nodded, his jaw set in resolve. "We'll find a way. We'll stop it together." For the next few days, they focused all their energy on finding a solution. Elias continued his research, digging deeper into alien phenomena, while Nissa worked to teach him about the technology and knowledge from her world. She showed him devices from her ship, small, intricate tools that seemed to defy all earthly logic. One of the devices caught Elias's eye, a strange, glowing orb that seemed to hum with energy. Nissa explained that it was a tracker, something her people used to track anomalies in space. "This device can locate energy signatures," she explained, her voice calm but still carrying the weight of urgency. "If we can get it to work, it might help us find the source of the force that is after me." Elias nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. He set to work on adapting the device to Earth's technology, his fingers flying across the controls as he worked. It wasn't easy. Alien technology was far more advanced than anything he had encountered before, but Elias's determination pushed him forward. As they worked together, Nissa seemed to grow stronger, more confident. The fear in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. She had seen horrors in her travels, but Elias could see that she was not the kind of person to give up. At night, they would sit on the porch of the cabin, watching the stars. Elias found that he didn't mind the silence anymore. There was something comforting in the presence of another person, even if that person was from a different world. Nissa had become more than just a patient to him. She had become a friend, a partner in this strange, unfolding adventure. One evening, as they sat together, Nissa spoke again. "I never expected to find someone like you," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Your people are different than I imagined. You have this strength in you, this sense of purpose." Elias glanced at her, surprised by the compliment. "I'm just doing what feels right," he said simply. "I'm not special." Nissa smiled faintly. "That is where you are wrong, Elias. You are special. You have a heart that is not driven by fear or greed. That is why you are able to help, even when you do not fully understand the danger." Elias looked away, feeling a warmth spread through him at her words. He had never considered himself anything more than an ordinary man, but Nissa's words made him feel like maybe he had something to offer after all. The next morning, as they finished working on the tracker, Elias felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, but he could feel it. Something was happening. He glanced at Nissa, who was standing by the door, her eyes scanning the horizon once again. "It's here," she said quietly. "I can feel it." Elias felt his heart race. "Are you sure?" Nissa nodded, her expression grim. "Yes, it's closer than ever. We don't have much time." They exchanged a glance, both understanding the gravity of the situation. The time for preparation was over. The storm was here. Together, they turned to face what was coming, knowing that whatever happened next, they would stand together. The air was thick with anticipation. Elias and Nissa stood side by side on the porch of the cabin, their eyes scanning the horizon. The strange energy they had felt growing stronger over the past few days had reached a peak. Elias could almost feel the weight of it in the air, pressing down on them. Nissa turned to him, her face set with determination. "This is it, Elias. It's coming. I can't explain exactly what it is, but I know it's near." Her voice was steady, but there was a trace of worry behind her words. Elias nodded. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he had no intention of backing down. The bond they had formed over the past few weeks had given him strength. Whatever this force was, they would face it together. "Do you think the tracker will work?" Elias asked, glancing at the small glowing orb in his hand. The device, a strange fusion of alien and human technology, had been their best hope to find the source of the energy Nissa had been feeling. Nissa looked at it, her expression unreadable. "It should. If it's truly what I think it is, the tracker will lock onto its energy signature." She looked away for a moment, her gaze distant. "But it will only show us where it is. The rest we have to figure out on our own." Elias held the tracker up and pressed a button. It hummed to life, its glow brightening in his hand. The device beeped once, twice. Then a series of lights blinked rapidly. "It's working," Elias said, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. Nissa took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes scanning the area. "It's close. Too close." Without another word, they turned and started toward the forest. The device led them through the trees, its hum growing louder as they approached the source of the energy. Elias's mind raced. What exactly were they heading into? What could possibly be so powerful that Nissa, an experienced traveler of the stars, was so afraid of it? Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, they arrived at a clearing. The energy from the tracker was nearly overwhelming now, the device's glow almost blinding. And in the center of the clearing stood a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette that seemed to shimmer and warp in the air. Elias stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The force Nissa had feared, the thing that had followed her across the stars. The figure stepped forward, its movements smooth but unnatural, as if it were both there and not there at the same time. A voice, no, a presence, filled the air, though there were no words. Just a deep, resonating hum that seemed to echo inside Elias's head. Nissa stood frozen, her eyes locked on the figure. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The entity that has been following me. It's called the Void. A force of pure energy. It consumes everything in its path. It is drawn to any source of life, and it seeks to drain that energy until nothing remains." Elias swallowed hard. "Can we stop it?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Nissa's eyes softened, but there was still fear in them. "I don't know. The Void doesn't have form. It is a presence that bends space and time. But it can be repelled. There is one thing I know that might stop it." Elias took a step closer. "What is it?" Nissa turned to him, her voice firm. "The energy of your world, Elias. Earth itself. It has a unique power that the Void cannot absorb. If we can draw enough of it, we might be able to push it back." Elias's mind raced. How do we do that? How do we draw the energy of the Earth? Nissa smiled faintly. "The planet's life force is in everything. In the trees, the soil, the oceans. We just have to connect to it. Your people might call it nature, but it's more than that. It's the pulse of your world, and it can be harnessed." Elias nodded, his mind shifting into action. They needed to act quickly. The Void was closing in, and they didn't have much time. "I can do this," he said, more to himself than to Nissa. "We can do this." Nissa stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. "Trust the Earth, Elias. Let it guide you. I will help you." Together, they knelt in the center of the clearing, Elias closing his eyes and reaching out. He could feel it, the subtle hum beneath the soil, the quiet pulse of life that ran through every living thing on the planet. It was a connection he had never felt before, but now, in this moment, it was clear. The Earth was alive, and it was responding to him. He focused, pulling that energy toward him, feeling it surge through the ground and into his body. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The power was raw and wild, but it was also beautiful, like a force of nature that flowed through him. Nissa's voice broke through his concentration. "It's working, Elias. Now, push it out. Push the energy toward the Void." With a burst of energy, Elias focused all of his strength into one final push. The ground beneath him trembled, and the Void, the dark figure in the clearing, suddenly recoiled. A wave of energy surged toward it, pushing it back with incredible force. The Void screeched in an eerie, unearthly sound, as if it were being torn apart. For a moment, everything was still. The clearing, once filled with tension, now seemed peaceful. The dark figure that had haunted Nissa was gone, dissipating into the air like smoke. Nissa stood, her expression a mix of awe and relief. "It's over," she whispered. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the energy of the Earth slowly fade back into balance. He looked at Nissa, his heart still racing, but there was a sense of calm now. "We did it," he said quietly. Nissa smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did, Elias. And for that, I will be forever grateful." As they stood together in the clearing, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The storm had passed, and with it, a new chapter began, for both of them.